Yeah.
Great. Good morning. For the record, Ryan Patch with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. Here today to answer questions for the committee about S-115 and related provisions. It's my understanding, and I've watched testimony to date, so understand there's been discussion about quality in the state, who's contributing to degrading water quality, who's working to improve it, how that's apportioned, and specific questions maybe within the agricultural arena about how different parts of a farm are defined. So I'm not sure if there's a specific prompt you'd like me to work from or a specific question. But you've heard from General Counsel Steve Collier for the Agency of Agriculture about the agency's position about this bill, and that it's in my view, a very simple, or it's a simple legal question about authorities. What I can answer is separate from this question about S-115 and what are the responsibilities of the municipality to meet the stormwater TMDLs for their particular stream segments, or to meet the requirements of specific stormwater permits that the town may be responsible for administering. What is agriculture responsible for? As I heard a question as we're getting going, DEC and their stormwater program manager and commissioner, I understand, are coming tomorrow. And so it may be good to ask them specifically, how are stormwater TMDLs developed? How similar what I'm going to talk about today about the phosphorus total maximum daily load for the different segments of the Lake Champlain Basin. I'm going to dig in with a bit of detail about how those land uses are modeled, apportioned to different sectors, how the loading is calculated, and then how the load reductions are similarly calculated. It would be helpful maybe to ask DEC for the stormwater side, how are those calculations done? Because it can be instructive to describe that in the state of Vermont, we have separate regulatory frameworks for agriculture, for non-point source management, which includes stormwater, then all of the other sectors. So, for example, discussions about joint fees, for example, AOT having to get a credit for some stormwater acreage they may have in a particular municipality. Well, AOT is regulated for stormwater because they're running a road network. Farms are different. Farms, both the production area and the cropland, are regulated by the required ag practices. And I guess I'll attempt to try to walk through how the rules look in reality, how a farm is seen through the eyes of the required ag practices. Has this committee gotten a copy of the required ag practices, the most recent rule, yet this year?
In writing?
In writing.
I'd love one.
Excellent. Excellent. Came prepared.
Many thanks.
So these required ag practices were last updated in 2018 to include requirements for tile drainage and recommendations for tile drainage. They were majorly rewritten in 2016, where they were transitioned from being called the accepted ag practices, which was a bit of a misnomer. People thought, oh, they're accepted. That means you can do whatever you want. They're not enforceable, not required. No, they were required. But the legislature changed the name to make clear in the title that these are non-point source regulations for farms, which are enforceable and have been since 1995. And so you have a little bit of a preamble, general, applicability, all the kind of, introductory stuff on the first 3 pages. And then the balance of it is the regulations for farming. Included in here is section 601 A and B, which prohibits the discharge from a farm. Right? This is not a CAFO permit. This is not stormwater, where a stormwater pond can infiltrate through a permeable liner and can overtop in conditions of high flow. Farmers have to collect their agricultural waste and manage it in an appropriate manner. So by and large, and I'll throw up some examples if folks would like to see it from a presentation I gave in 2018 to the House Ag Committee about what some of the infrastructure looks like. But whether it is a barnyard where cows are congregating prior to going in to a barn, whether it's silage leachate from the stacking and packing of feed in a horizontal bunk, that runoff cannot leave the production area. It has to be managed. And one of the most appropriate and common ways is total collection. And so every other requirement separate from, well, I won't say every other because it's all some design standards for the waste storage facilities, et cetera. But after defining, what are our terms, who's regulated, who's a certified small farm, you have to get training. Section 6 is really the meat and potatoes of prohibiting discharge, and then the agricultural non-point source requirements for managing the farmstead. And then you get into the Agency of Agriculture's oversight of the construction of farm structures, which interfaces with the municipalities. As you've heard, we try to follow town zoning, but the Agency of Agriculture is the statewide overseer for the siting and construction of farm structures.
Representative O'Brien?
Just quickly, are these, what title are they in? 6?
These implement the requirements in Title 6, Chapter 215, the agricultural water quality chapter of the ag statutes. And so this
In statute, or there are rules that respond to something in statute?
The Agency of Agriculture is directed in 6 VSA Chapter 215 to adopt the required agricultural practices and implement the minimum standards that are outlined in there. So if you read the sections of Chapter 215, you'll see a number of requirements, which is you can't have a discharge, and then also standards around small farm certification and training, buffer requirements, manure, prohibiting winter spreading. And so the rules implement those standards, and the agency also adopted requirements that will, in the 2016 amendment, that will support farmers to meet the phosphorus reductions required by the TMDL. So you'll find some of the standards established in law, and then the agency has used its knowledge of regulating farms since 1995 to establish some additional requirements in these rules. But it's a non-point source pollution control program, and it is some of the most restrictive requirements in this country because there are no discharges, unlike maybe the CAFO program. And, maybe some states have a buffer requirement, but this has a whole scale, whole farm management from nutrient management to soil loss requirements to the storage and collection standards.
Ryan?
Yeah.
When we say discharge is prohibited, no discharges, but a discharge of water?
We are talking about the discharge of agricultural waste from the production area. When I say no discharges, farms shall not create any discharge of agricultural waste to surface waters of the state through a discrete conveyance, such as but not limited to a pipe, ditch, or conduit without a permit from the Secretary of ANR. They do that, it's ANR's jurisdiction. The second part of the discharges section states production areas, barnyards, animal holding or feedlot areas, manure storage areas, and feed storage areas shall utilize runoff and leachate collection systems, diversions, or other management strategies in order to prevent the discharge of agricultural waste to surface or groundwater.
And agricultural waste might be manure, but it might also be you were talking earlier, maybe you wonder, could it be related to feed if
waste or agricultural waste is defined in section 2.39. It means material originating or emanating from a farm that is determined by the Secretary of Natural Resources to be harmful to waters of the state, including sediments, minerals, including heavy metals, plant nutrients, pesticides, organic waste, including livestock waste, animal mortalities, compost, feeding crop debris, waste oils, pathogenic bacteria, viruses, thermal pollution, silage, runoff, untreated milkhouse waste, and any other farm waste as the term waste is defined in 10 VSA 1251.12. So it's comprehensive in its description of what can't run off from a farm production area.
Ryan, This is Josie. Can I ask you just to reference what you were reading from? Because you read it all so very fast.
That was intentional. It's kind of wordy. I'm reading from the Required Agricultural Practices Handbook or Rule, page 10, definition 2.39, waste or agricultural waste.
Thank you very much.
There's a copy at your desk now.
And
Excellent.
it's available digitally as well, and we can send the link so it gets posted. But if you search RAPs for Vermont, it generally comes up first.
Representative O'Brien?
Brian, are there any farms that say, we're gonna put all our, say, production runoff into a ditch and get an A&R permit?
There's no, that's allowed. You
Well, it'd be allowed, right, if A&R,
No, I mean, we can let NR speak to the CAFO requirements, right? But it's a permit to discharge when weather conditions are appropriate. You can't just have manure running off into a ditch, right? That is the goal is to ensure manure and other ag waste is collected and managed and then land applied according to nutrient management plan. If you have manure or leachate leaving the farm production area, going into a ditch, going into a road network ditch, going into a surface water, right, that is not allowed. Period.
Representative Lipsky?
Yeah, Ryan, I understand the agricultural production area, but let's say you have fields and after your last harvest or in the spring, you spread manure spray all over your hayland, and it rains within a week, and some of the runoff from that field may reach some type of wetland. It was done in a approved season. It was done under the right conditions. Is that a violation? That is clearly crop land. It's not production land.
So Mr. O'Grady described in his two testimonies, to my recollection, the ag stormwater exemption. And one thing I'm going to put up on the screen here is a very busy slide. So I apologize. I'm answering your question. I'm just taking a while to get
I'm
there.
listening.
And I can point to the specific standards within the RAPs where some, depending on the weather and the soil conditions, antecedent soil conditions, what the weather forecast is, it may or may not be a violation, right? It depends. If you're spreading and Irene is coming and you're trying to empty your pits because you're worried about overtopping, right? You can't spread your manure because you know it's going to get washed away. We have flash rainstorms in Vermont, right? And you can't always plan for that. And we can talk about site-specific conditions. But to your question of, so here on the upper left-hand side, right, we have the water quality trends. Down here, we have the load coming from different sectors, the land cover, and then the loading per land cover type. On here, on the right-hand side is what I want to talk about, which is this is the total maximum daily load for phosphorus for all segments of the Lake Champlain Basin. This top pie chart is what the starting loading condition is as modeled by Tetra Tech and EPA. And then what we're getting down to here on the bottom is what the loading is going to be at the end of the 20-year TMDL. And you'll notice that agriculture starts at an annual loading of 261 metric tons per year and is going down to 118 metric tons per year. The goal is not to get to zero. It's in a natural system. There is always going to be loss of some sort. There's inefficiencies in any physical process and biological process. And so the goal is not to get in any of these sectors, and it's impossible to get to zero. The goal is to get to a reduction where loading is compatible with water quality standards and other environmental goals of the state. And so agriculture here is tagged with 41% of the load. When they come at the end of the TMDL, they're going to be much more balanced. And why is that? It's because agriculture in the TMDL is taking on more than they're loading. They are going to be reducing more than they are contributing for a number of reasons. We can talk about that within the context of all all in and what does all in mean. Wastewater treatment facilities, as an example, are given an allocation to grow their discharges over the span of the TMDL because there's forecast to be population growth in our urban centers in Vermont. And so agriculture is reducing more than they're contributing, because they're a cost-effective place to make investments by the state on a dollar per kilogram reduction basis. And we can talk about some of those efficiencies if you like. But also we have very strong requirements for farms in the 2016 amendment, which is driving a lot of those management changes on farms. So to get to the specific questions in the RAPs, and we can talk about some of the specific sections if you like, as I stumble and look for the specifics, like under 604, manure or other agricultural waste. This is section 605B, page 23 of the required ag practices. This is language that's related to the weather, right? You don't farm in a vacuum. It's not perfectly sunny every day. It doesn't rain at night a nice little bit. You always have to be cognizant of antecedent moisture conditions, the type of manure you're spreading on a field, if it's the digestate or if it's solid manure, you have different risks for runoff, et cetera. But this is the weather-based standards here, D&E. Manure or other agricultural waste shall not be applied when field conditions are conducive to flooding, runoff, ponding, or other off-site movement, or can reasonably can be reasonably anticipated to result in flooding, runoff, ponding, or other offsite movement, regardless of nutrient management plan recommendations. So, Mr. O'Grady described the ag stormwater exemption. When you apply manure to a crop field based on an NMP, farms are required to have an NMP in the state of Vermont. However, they also have to watch the weather. You can't spread in a rainstorm. You can't, it's all dependent. So we answer a lot of questions. It drizzled a little bit this morning. I spread manure. It's like, well, your best professional judgment. If you apply, is it going to run off? No. It's like, do you have a buffer? He's like, yeah, I got a 50-foot buffer. It's like, you're probably okay to spread. But everything, when the designing ag non-point source standards for farms, it's not every farm is the same. You have really flat fields with, in certain parts of the state, you have very steep and stony fields in other parts of the state. And so that's why the RAPs are performance standard. You can't have runoff. And then there are specific standards that we know when you do this, in our experience, you're going to have runoff. And that is spreading when fields are super saturated. That's going to cause it to not be able to infiltrate. You're adding 4,000 to 6,000, 8,000 gallons per acre, right? If you have even just a little bit of slope and it's all wet, it's going to run off. And so that's why that was established as a standard in the RAPs.
Representative Stern.
Thank you. How often are farms inspected to make sure they're in compliance with their RAPs?
I believe you got a presentation from the Water Quality Division about it's a Power BI interface, and I can pull that up if you'd like the results of those inspections. But the legislature establishes the standard for inspection for 3 categories of farms. Large farms are inspected annually and all of their production areas. So a large farm may be made up of one big area, a bunch of heifer barns, maybe they bought another farm or they have a small milking operation. As part of an LFO permit, all of those facilities are inspected on an annual basis. Medium farms are inspected on a 3-year cycle. CSFOs, the Certified Small Farm Operations, the agency was given the latitude to establish that inspection cycle in 7 years is what is reasonable for the agency's the number of staff resources we have relative to the number of CSFOs that are out there. They're inspected on a 7-year basis. Every other size farm is inspected on a complaint basis, and the agency investigates all complaints of alleged water quality violations. Referrals are made to DEC if this is suspected to be a complaint source.
Representative O'Brien and then Representative Templeman.
Oh, I was just curious about when Michael Brady was giving us to talk about some of stuff. Is snow coming down stormwater, or is it when it melts?
Snow?
Snow. Because we're talking about stormwater and stormwater runoff. So I was just wondering, rain falls, runs off, snow in winter, right, doesn't go anywhere until it melts, right? So I was wondering if there.
What happens when it turns to a gas? I don't know.
Just different precipitation.
Yeah, I mean, you can't. The road crews can't take the snow from the street and dump it in Boston Harbor, right? Like the snow has to, if it gets contaminated, you can't stack it in a ditch if it's contaminated with manure and leachate. It's definitely a management challenge on farms, I think. But, you know, generally with it snowing, things are frozen and they're not moving. So it tends not to be, that's why the design and implementation of these production area practices on farms end up being very expensive, is because you have to do planning for a lot of conditions. It's not just when it's nice and sunny and raining. You have times a year when you're dealing with snow and ice, and how do you have a transfer system that works when it's -20? You know, it's definitely takes some planning and engineering. But yes, it's definitely something that has to be planned for, and you can't have a runoff any time of year.
Yeah, sorry.
Could you put that back up?
I'd be more than happy to.
Thank you so much. So that, on the right of the screen, there's an implied equation with the reductions. And I'm curious how that's done, both mathematically and, how are these calculated?
There are two graphics here, and I can pull it up from the establishment letter. This is from the total maximum daily load for phosphorus for the Vermont segments of the Lake Champlain Basin, right? So this is from the TMDL process for Lake Champlain. These two, this is the beginning conditions. These are the ending conditions. And this is just math that's been conducted to represent. These two are published by EPA. This is analysis the agency did. When you start at 261 and you go down to 118, what percent of 213 metric tons per year is that reduction? And that's just how that math.
But where's the reduction happening in reality? Like, so if there's this number metric tons in the waterways per year, but it comes out of the stream at 118, where's the rest going? Where is it being sequestered, I guess, is the question.
So I will attempt to quickly hope that I added to this presentation. There you go. I'll just pull up the team deal itself. See if I can find it. Stormwater TMDLs, general permits. There we go. Oh, this is the appendix. All right. So, back to sharing my screen. Apologies.
No problem.
So, table 7, 8, and 9 are the portions of the TMDL that describe the allocations for the different sectors. And I think this is important for describing whether it's a stormwater TMDL or a phosphorus TMDL. They don't just say, this is the starting condition, this is where you have to get to figure out reductions. They model the contributions based on land area and intensity of use and contribution within those land areas. So what we have here are a bunch of different categories that are given an allocation, what the base load is and what the loading capacity is within the lake segments. And then the wastewater treatment facilities, the combined sewer overflow, the developed lands, which includes roads and residential stormwater, the allocation for future growth within the developed areas, and then the agricultural production areas. So these wasteload allocations are all the point source, whether permitted or whether a permit program applies or sub-jurisdictional. But you'll notice that the agricultural production areas are separate from the developed lands, wasteload allocation. The load allocation is the non-point source side, and that's where you see your forests, your streams, and your agricultural fields. And so when they do planning for TMDL establishment, they are looking at the different land uses and the relative share of the cover and how much they contribute. Then what we have are the percent reductions that are needed by sector to meet the TMDA allocation. So you're starting from here, you have to reduce how much of a percentage from the baseline to get to that allocation. And again, it's described by lake segment. We can see the ag non-point source has a very heavy lift, and the agricultural production area has an 80% reduction, as that is what EPA applied to the agency of ag, the state of Vermont's non-point source program, which says you can't have a discharge. Well, what does that look like? That's going to be an 80% reduction when the farm is found to be compliant with the required ag practices. And that's what we do. We go out and inspect farms, and if they are compliant with the RAPs in the production area, they are certified to be meeting those standards. And for that ag production area, they are given a credit for the acreage in the TMDL accounting. Ag non-point source, how is that calculated? That comes from the application of conservation practices on the ground. So you do a cover crop, you do a crop rotation, you have a wider buffer, you do manure injection, you change your grazing management. Those all have a phosphorus reduction coefficient that DEC, EPA, and the Agency of Ag agreed on that's applied on a per acre basis.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
You're saying a lot here. So basically, the reductions are the estimated reductions of practices done by at the source.
Nope. So this is just saying this is what you have to get to. State of Vermont, how are you going to get here? TMDL says this is where you're starting. These are the criteria that are going to meet water quality standards, and then gave it to the state of Vermont to say, how are you going to meet this? And the agency of ag, ANR, AOT, all the agencies had a lot of stakeholder meetings to discuss. The agency of ag had an ag working group, which met for 2 years to say, okay, EPA's here. They disapproves the TMDL. We have to meet these reductions. How farmers are you going to meet these reductions? And that came out in a report, and that informed a lot of the changes that went into the required ag practices. And so that's a different document. That's the phase one implementation plan. That is describing the EPA across all sectors. What is each sector going to do to meet these water quality?
After the reductions, the third of the three pies, is that what is actually flowing into our bodies of water? Or is that what is estimated to be after those reductions are put into place?
So this
right here. So this is what we're actually saying the actual flow is of. No.
This is, so on the left is the long-term monitoring, that the top left here. Each year, DEC Basin Program does in-lake water quality monitoring in all of the bays to understand what the phosphorus concentration level is in the water column. So
Yes.
we know what the water quality is, and you can see this is the standard. We're above the standard, and trend line is getting worse.
Right.
Okay, that's reflected here across all of those segments. We have a base load of 631 metric tons.
Right.
To meet water quality standards, we have to get down to 418.
Aha.
213 metric ton reduction. That's represented by these sectoral allocations.
Okay, so this pie chart represents that dotted blue line here.
Yes.
Yeah, that's where we're trying to get to.
Yep.
But we're not there yet. And these are the proposed things we need to do to get there.
By sector, what does each sector have to reduce from this base load to meet?
How successful are we at doing this? Not very, I guess, because of the
Well,
dots.
that's 2015, so maybe.
Oh, okay. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
Well, I can pull up the Clean Water Investment Report from DEC, which will give you all of the information you would like about reductions by sector. I'm just going to scroll and save you getting dizzy. Here we go. So this is, well, let's do the sectoral looks better, and then we'll do where we're at. Sorry, it's a very long report, 117 pages, details investment, reduction efficiencies.
Ryan,
Yes,
so it's a 20-year plan. When's the 20th year?
2038.
Okay.
Yeah, where's my chart? There it is. All right, here we go. It's down on page 36. And then we'll go back to the first page that shows the progress.
And I think maybe everyone gets this, but just to be sure that it's not a question anybody, the federal government, the EPA directed Vermont to make these.
Oh, they're not our goals.
Well, it all started with the federal government, right?
The state of Vermont does water quality monitoring. If you don't meet the water standards for long enough, you have to go through a whole set of processes to list it as threatened or impaired. And once it's impaired, you have to come up with TMDL, and EPA administers those. But it depends. You can ask DEC all about what the standards are. So these are the phosphorus load reductions of state investment. So Act 64 2015. These programs have been implemented since state fiscal year 2016, and you can see the total metric tons on an annual basis that have been reduced. And you can see that the agricultural sector is doing over 95% of the reductions to date based on this reporting. Also included in here is the natural resources, the stormwater, and the roads. I hope that I find soon, oh good, it's still in order, the cost effectiveness by sector. So here we have the estimated cost per kilogram of total phosphorus, right? Ag pollution prevention, median $96 per kilogram from our field and pasture practices. Our natural resource restoration are around 270. Road erosion, $1,600, and stormwater treatment, $3,471 per kilogram. And so why is agriculture doing 59% of the reduction when they're only 41% of the load? Well, the state established these structures where there's a clean water fund. Funding goes to the Agency of Agriculture. The Agency of Agriculture supports farmers to come into compliance with the RAPs and to exceed the RAP minimums through financial assistance programs. We document where those conservation practices are implemented, where there is compliance with the RAPs, and those inform both the total reduction reporting as well as an analysis for cost effectiveness. And so since ag is so cost effective, probably makes sense to invest in agriculture rather than a whole bunch of very expensive wastewater treatment facility upgrades or potentially more stormwater treatment. And so to try to tie this back to S115, right, the legislature established a $2,500 permit fee for large farms and a $1,500 permit fee for medium farms, basically to so they can be inspected. And municipalities are assessing a fee that very often for small farms exceeds those medium farm thresholds. So the legislature grappled during that time of establishing how we're going to pay for clean water with a small farm fee for for inspection and being certified through the RAP program, but the legislature declined based on analysis of it's better for farmers to put their investment into cleaning up the water and making further improvements in the farms, rather than it's just they don't have the economic capacity for a lot, and so in a lot of cases you have municipalities assessing fees on small farms that exceed the medium farm permit threshold, and they're going to investments that are much less cost effective and are practices that farmers can even implement on their farms, right? The stormwater ponds infiltrate over top. Farm manure pits must store the manure without overtopping or discharge, and they must be drawn down and field applied during the growing season according to a nutrient management plan. And so just trying to make that linkage about cost effectiveness, the legislature declined to charge farms a permit fee for being a certified small farm based on based on how much they have to do. The fact that they're allowing wastewater treatment facilities to contribute more over the lifespan of TMDL, it isn't fair that, in my view, that they're being assessed when they're asked to do so much. They're so heavily regulated, and there's currently an economic viability crisis across multiple sectors of agriculture. And so this is just to try to put in perspective for the phosphorus reduction reporting side, where the contributions are coming from. And this is to answer your question, how are we doing? Here is the progress projections for state fiscal year based on trends. So these are just different trend lines that you can look at, but that's blue line, right? Blue line, we got to get up to those reductions. And the other chart, we got to get down to the blue line here. We have to get up to it. Here's where we are. And then here are the trends based on the first couple years, and then where we need to get to. So,
Representative Templeman, did you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of a reiteration. Basically, farmers are getting triple billed for this is what you're, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to pay for a condo HOA stormwater pond, right? I mean, that's what's happening. And it's, it's not fair, given how much, so for example, like to give a practical example, there's a farm in Chittenden County that implemented a $660,000 production area investment. Collects from the roof, it collects from the barnyard, it collects from the bunk, it collects from the livestock congregating area, and all of that goes into a slurry store, and then during the growing season that is drawn down and land applied based on the NMP, there is literally none of that water makes it into a ditch network. And if it did make it into a ditch network, that's a violation, right? That's why we have these inspections. That's why the state and federal government work together through their EQIP program and our BMP program to support the implementation of these very expensive infrastructure projects to make sure there isn't runoff. I think farmers would like to be able to have stormwater runoff like a Walmart parking lot because it costs them a heck of a lot less to manage all of that semi-dirty water that's on their farm. But to use the Chittenden County farm example, $660,000, getting $1,800, $900, close to $2,000 bill for their stormwater contribution, which the town has mapped. The town has mapped their farmstead and said, this is impervious surface, pay us this fee. The towns, the residential property owners have a ratio of like one ERU, like erosion runoff unit or environmental runoff. I forget what they call it. Maybe Wilson is different, but this farm is 9.5. And so that's based on a single family home. It works out to about a half acre of impervious cover that they're charging them for, but there is functionally no runoff from that farm to any networks that the town has to manage. And so that's just a pretty clear example of why the regulatory framework that's been in place since 1995. And these RAPs are administered by the Agency of Agriculture. Towns don't regulate farms. DEC, other than a construction stormwater permit, does not regulate farms for stormwater because they are managed by or governed by the RAPs, and the Agency of Agriculture is there to inspect and ensure compliance. And farms, by and large, are compliant, over 75% compliance, which is, in my view, extremely impressive considering we just started regularly inspecting certified small farms beginning really in 2017, 2018. So really impressive work on the part of the farmers, and something that I thought was a very straightforward understanding about how farms are regulated in the state, within the TMDL for phosphorus, and I'll pull this up in a second. You can look at the loading by subwatershed, and I'll pull this up, but the agriculture croplands are separated from the agricultural production areas, which is separate from developed lands impervious surface, which is separated from roads, right? They use remote sensing to figure out the land area within a watershed and what that land use is in. They then apply a coefficient of loading for that particular type of land use and apportion it to that sector. And so when all in was the rallying cry for Act 64 2015, we're all going to do our part. It was every sector has to do their fair share. And the way that stormwater TMDLs are calculated is the same way. There's developed land stormwater contribution, then open and agricultural lands. They are separate loading calculations that are apportioned separately, and the municipalities assessing a fee on a farm to support their responsibility. As General Counsel from Steve Colliers explained, we don't believe there is the authority for them to do that to begin with. But functionally, within all the permitting programs, agriculture is not part of their responsibility. And so they shouldn't be looking to ag to raise revenue for their responsibility. I know they're in a hard place. I know they have significant reduction requirements, but farmers similarly have a very challenging economic landscape, and they don't set the price for the commodities they produce by and large. And so they're holding this, significant environmental responsibility. And luckily, the state and federal programs there support their implementation of these programs. But there's still a lot of time, effort, and money. You'll look at the Agency of Ag's reporting figures. We document the farmer contribution for their, it's millions of dollars across the farms they have to implement on a annual basis.
Brian, we need to about
5 minutes.
Sure.
Representative O'Brien's got a question. I just wanted to ask though first, could you mention, you sort of listed roads,
impervious surfaces, a road, a farm
road.
or even a roof that the water, rainwater, stormwater might land on and then splash off, that's not arguably in a production area. And I don't know whether that makes sense, but how is that considered?
Access roads to a farm field.
Use the access road, maybe just that example.
It is,
So it's considered impervious.
sure, but it's surrounded by 200 acres of cropland. Functionally, farms can access their fields. They don't have to improve them. They can be a muddy mess and get out there. So when they install a BMP to add gravel, they can do that. A farm road is not part of a farm road can be part of a production area. It can also be part of access for the field. And the balance of, you're not spreading manure on a road, as an example, you're spreading on all the fields. All the analysis I've seen done for cropland is focused on the cropland.
John.
Right. One thing that seems obvious here is that all pollution is not the same. And so we're talking about farm runoff, which is actually, can be beneficial in that we allow farmers later on to land apply it, which is not the same with, say, the sort of poisons or pollution that are going through stormwater treatment plants, sewage treatment plants. I mean, there's, PFAS, microplastics. We don't really like to put sewage from those plants on fields anymore. So what's that conversation? I mean, it seems like the TMDLs are focused on all pollution is the same, or it's all phosphorus is the same, but it seems like there's really nasty stuff in places, and farms, for the most part, it's actually stuff that works with growing crops.
That's a whole other kettle of fish, that question. So I think about, I'll answer your question with a non-answer, but I will try to answer your question, I'm kidding. But, I think about these stormwater TMDLs, right? And that's a result of generally human development around farms, right? Farms are, whether it was the collapse of the sheep industry or, just these urban areas are seeing population growth. That's, it is taking open agricultural land and putting development on it, right? Act 250 has some criteria for looking at primary agricultural soils, but if you look at lots of parts of Chittenden County, sprawl and development is certainly a part of the landscape there. And so these stormwater TMDLs are not the result of farms farming, right? It's a result of humans building the built environment to live in. And so what is this balance between let's bring back to ecosystem services. What is the ecosystem services of a crop field compared to a parking lot, right? There's the ability for the hay field, the pasture, the cornfield to take flooding waters and let it sit and then flow back in rather than it, being a riprap house that sends the water right downstream in ever increasing volumes and takes all infrastructure downstream. So, when it rains, it's not going into a storm drain and it's not collecting all of the oils antifreeze from the road and piping it directly into the Winooski as an example, right? It is coming off of a farm, off of a town road, going into a culvert and coming onto a farm field where the farmers are mad about the town just dumped all this water here. I got a wet spot in my field. So the balance of service from the stormwater side that agriculture provides as a service, I much rather see, open agricultural fields as a part of the landscape to provide a buffer to a changing climate, as opposed to a fee that's, making it, for example, there are some farms that still carry the dairy infrastructure in Chittenden County. They're doing crop farming or vegetables, but they have the infrastructure for a small or medium farm, and they're being assessed for a small or medium farm without the cash flow of the dairy. And so if you want to see diversification of farming operations within, near urban areas, they're being assessed a fee where they don't have the cash flow necessary to carry it. So what's the result of that? Well, let's sell some land so that we can pay for the tax bill, or we just don't, we don't have the cash, and that's going to, just result in more impervious surface development, which is going to, be more of a challenge for the towns to meet their stormwater TMDLs.
So when you say they're being assessed a fee, you're
About the municipal stormwater fee explicitly.
the subject of this
Yes, the subject of this bill.
legislation. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm thinking of one particular farm in Williston that's no longer a dairy farm, but they're carrying all the infrastructure. They're trying to do some value added or, different types of crops, or they have some beef, but, the barn's big and beautiful, historic, but they're being assessed as if just, another farm down the road that does have cows in it, but the cash flow situations are very different. And it's challenging to deal with that fee when anyways, so just some of the challenges in these spaces, acknowledging that the municipalities have a responsibility and requirement to meet this, and they got to find a way to raise that revenue. It shouldn't be done on the backs of a sector that is already struggling and is providing a lot of benefit, I think, in the stormwater space. Acknowledging, as Mr. Collier shared yesterday, the farmer dwelling is not a farm structure by definition. And so the dwelling is absolutely subject to the stormwater user fee for the farmer themselves.
We'll stop there.
Okay.
I'm sure we're going to have more questions, maybe not maybe not this session, but we'll have you back at some point.
Absolutely. I just wanted to put up here for the Missisquoi Bay Basin, just how this is from the appendix of the SWOT modeling for the TMDL, looking at the contributions by land sector, right? So the high level categories, yellow ag, green forest, red develop, but then it goes down into the roads, the paved and unpaved roads, the residential, the farmsteads, both medium, large, and small, pasture, hay, corn haying. So, the modeling is very explicit. And so when we talk about the ag contribution relative to developed lands contribution, right, the contributions, at least in the TMDL, are different. And stormwater TMDL similarly have a distinction for the developed lands versus the open and agricultural.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ryan.
So let's take a break and let's be back.